Picking Up the Pieces is a 2022 player tabletop role-playing game about... See, explaining the rules, the systems in it, would probably prove to be a bit of an anticlimax. This game is only 11 pages long, and that includes cover, credits, content warnings, and a table of contents. It's a breezy read for what it is. It systematizes something that we don't actually have a really good word for. See, English has a word for a statue of a saint who is holding their own severed head. We have a word for convincing a stranger to watch the opening few seconds of the song Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley. What we don't have a word for, at least not one I know, is the moment of raw conversation about a relationship that predicates either an emotional renewal or a breakup. Picking Up the Pieces is a liminal game. What you're going to do with the other player, and it is one other player, this is a 2-player game, is using a series of prompts that you will construct, work out how your relationship came to be the way it is, and what you're going to do about that going forward. Whether you're okay with understanding each other the way things are now, or if you need to be able to say, no, we're done. It wants to put you entirely in the space where the relationship is a thing remembered, and the renewal or the breakup is a thing that concludes the story. You are remembering your backstory. You are not experiencing it or changing it. This is not a game where the dice are going to get involved to explain how good a job you did at something. The dice are used in a situation where the game actually says, hey, if you've got a better idea than the dice, you should use the better idea. I like the use of dice in this because it's very easy when you are dealing with these emotional subjects as a creator, as a writer, to get in your head that things need to have a dramatic break, that they need to be perfectly solved, or they need to have a major step done. Whereas the dice say, hey look, this can be small incremental improvements. You might have made it just by being good enough, a little bit at a time. It's extremely rules light. You aren't here to memorize a rule set. There is almost no mastery of the game. You're not going to need to know all the possible cards that could come out of some hypothetical deck, or what mechanical twists or gambits your opponents might use on you. You will make all of your own pieces, and one of the steps in this game is to read through the whole rulebook with the other person, just to make sure that you and they both understand the rules in the same way on the same level. This is part of why it's as short as it is, I imagine. The notion of just going through the rules for systems like combat or tactical movement in some games together as a communal experience strikes me as incredibly difficult to do, whereas for this game, you might be able to do it very quickly. What the game winds up asking, in my opinion, is the question, what are games even for? Alright? Okay, so it's an extremely art piece, tabletop RPG about relationship tension or breakups or whatever, and yes, if you go looking, you will be able to find a lot of games that are like that. Especially small games, especially games made by presenters on itch, especially people who have maybe one or two things made, period, and who are just experimenting with the form. I don't know about many of them. I didn't find them thanks to some exhaustive and comprehensive comparative research. I looked at this game because I already had it. I had it in the bundle for racial justice. I'm not speaking about whether or not this is a good example of what it is in that greater landscape of extremely emotionally challenging TTRPGs put up on itch, usually by marginalized creators. A long time ago, in one of my other videos about the comedy special Nanette, I talked about a game I designed that was about contrasting one of the most well-known historical genocides with the genocides of all the countries that claim to have averted the other one. The idea of that game was to, for a start, get you in a very irreverent mood, poking fun at some of the worst people in history, and then shock you with a realization that the distance between these worst people and our own worst histories, which are still ongoing, are not so different, and that there's a reason that we should be making amends and reckoning with our past beyond just remembering that one time we won something. And that game ultimately is probably never going to get made. I just couldn't imagine myself following through on the joke anymore. There was definitely a point in my life where I would be that kind of defiant person. I still think about that game, though, in the context of the question, what's a game and who's it for? I wouldn't consider picking up the pieces to be fun. I definitely don't think this game is about fun. I think that there are definitely going to be people who do find it fun, but we'll get to that. What I do think is that this game is engaging. It's interesting. It's intriguing. It catches at my mind and makes me wonder about things and think about tools for games. And it makes all of this part of its system. It's interesting to look at the way the game creates pauses for reflection and makes its experience meditative and shared. It is a game for two people. Just two. It's about the relationship between those two people, and they may be partners or friends or siblings or even parent and child, and the game cares about the conversation about reconciliation or redress. This is one of those games that I want to see exist, and I think it's worth people investigating, because the audience for it is small, but you may never know you're part of that audience if no one ever presented it to you. A lot of you are going to look at this and go, oh, well, I don't need this game in my life. I have other options or just real life trauma to sort out, thanks. And that's okay. But it's not everyone. And this is something that we often say we want in games that we generally don't get. Games are very rarely about relationships being repaired. They're often about them starting, about fitting two puzzle pieces against one another perfectly. But in many cases, they do that by being extremely static and reliable and tropey. This game is dynamic and messy and creative and, to me, extremely challenging. I don't know how I'd feel if one of my friends wanted to play it for its own sake. But I want it to be seen. I want people to remember that your games and your ideas don't have to be fun. Games are the consensual overcoming of unnecessary obstacles. We use games for all sorts of things, and one thing we use games for is to play with ideas in a space that is safe for that play. A safe space, if you will. This game plays with extremely jagged and extremely painful ideas, and it does it with a lot of care in only 11 pages. But, alright, look, say it's couples counseling the RPG. Why use this game? why not use any other game? Why use this game, and what does it offer you in the space of the type of game it is? First thing is expertise. If you asked me, a fairly accomplished game jam style designer, to design a game about couples counseling, I would probably have to start by doing a lot of research into parameters and boundaries and good practice. And I haven't done that. This game, on the other hand, has research behind it, and it has had safety readers, and it has had a consultant. These are important things. These are things that are worth regarding when you are looking at RPGs. You don't have to do all that work yourself. Someone else has done it, and probably gotten paid for it. Game also offers safety. It has clearly defined rules and boundaries that are meant to give the narrative sinew, but which are also there to ensure that each player has the means to stop play when they need to, without it being a catastrophic break in the game's diegesis. Stopping a game because you can't handle it is something very few games can handle. Restarting it is something even more games break down doing. So this game having that built in from day one is really useful. And finally, a reason to look at this game is because it gives you permission. Why would someone willingly and for fun fantasize through the experience of one of the worst things that can happen to people who live to talk about it? Well, in this case, you're doing it because it's the game. Someone else designed this game, it has rules, and it's not your fault that it is the way it is. This game invites you to play in its space, even if it's not a space you would have ever conceived of as a place to play before. Finally, who wants this game? Who is this game, as it were, for? I'd argue that there are three categories of players who want this game. Obviously, there's a category of people for whom the novelty alone of this is a game about navigating the mishmash of feelings and creating a sharing narrative with another player is just mashing all the shiny buttons in your brain. And yes, you should drop your $10 to look at the PDF and go, ooh, interesting, and then maybe find another person like you to play it. There's also people for whom this kind of play presents something that they can see as therapeutic, but which you can't quite handle being real. We play games to engage with fictions that we can engage with, to give us a handle on reality. Picking Up the Pieces is a game where you can deal with this kind of story because it's not about you, and it's not about them, and you can learn how a person might react in these situations. Especially if that person is someone you have to then sympathize with. I'm definitely not saying you should play games with your friends as therapy, but I am saying that if games are the best way for you to approach something difficult to you, that's a meaningful thing to seek out as long as everyone involved is informed. I also think if you do therapy or counseling, there are worse tools to have available to you than a game with a rule set that might allow people that distance they need to start working on complicated feelings like this. And finally, for the greater audience, I do think this game is a really useful toolkit for implementation in other kinds of games that lack this system. In other games, whether you're stabbing Draculas or posting bad tweets, they probably don't have a system for this, and it may be something you want to do as part of the game's fiction. It can be implemented as a module, where you and another player or the DM do a side story that other players don't have to be there for while you grapple with this very intense mechanical system, without it being just the headbutting between real players trying to generate an argument and also find a way to set it down safely. I think this game is really interesting. In the end, I think that games are better if more people are trying more things in more different ways. This is one such example. And if it sounded interesting to you, the least you can do is go check out the page on itch and see what you think.